What if America's most important strategic vulnerabilities wasn't hidden beneath the ocean, or buried inside a military base, but flowed quietly across an international border every single day? For decades, millions of Americans have depended on a river they rarely think about. It powers cities, irrigates farmland, supports major industries, and keeps one of the largest hydroelectric systems in the world operating around the clock. Yet the source of that river lies outside the United States, and that's where the story begins. For more than 60 years, the United States and Canada managed that shared resource through a carefully negotiated framework designed to reduce flooding, coordinate dam operations, and stabilize electricity production across the Pacific Northwest. It wasn't simply an environmental agreement. It became one of the most successful examples of long-term infrastructure cooperation anywhere in the world. Because rivers don't recognize political borders, water released upstream in Canada determines what happens hundreds of miles downstream inside the United States. Reservoir levels influence hydroelectric output. Seasonal snowmelt affects irrigation. Flood control decisions made north of the border can directly shape communities, agriculture, and industry on the American side. For decades, both governments accepted a simple reality: geography made cooperation far more valuable than confrontation. That arrangement helped transform the Columbia River system into one of North America's most productive economic corridors. Massive hydroelectric dams generated reliable electricity for millions of homes and businesses. Agricultural regions expanded around predictable water supplies. Commercial shipping connected inland producers with Pacific markets. Entire regional economies grew around the assumption that the river would continue operating under stable rules. Those assumptions lasted for generations. Then politics began changing faster than infrastructure. As trade tensions between Washington and Ottawa intensified, issues that had little connection to water tariffs, manufacturing, energy exports, and industrial policy started reshaping the broader relationship. What had once been treated as separate policy areas slowly became interconnected. The river, despite decades of stability, was no longer isolated from political pressure. Negotiators had spent years discussing how to modernize the original agreement for changing environmental conditions, evolving energy markets, and new economic realities. Both countries recognized that a treaty written in the early Cold War could eventually require updates for the 21st century. Progress appeared possible, but political transitions rarely leave complicated international agreements untouched. When leadership changed in Washington, priorities changed with it. Instead of treating the modernization process as a technical infrastructure issue, it increasingly became part of a broader review of America's international commitments. From Washington's perspective, nearly every agreement with major trading partners became subject to renegotiation. The assumption seemed straightforward. If the United States applied enough economic pressure, Canada would eventually return to the negotiating table prepared to offer additional concessions. That approach had already appeared across multiple areas of bilateral relations. Trade disputes intensified. Tariff discussions expanded. Political rhetoric became increasingly public. The expectation inside Washington appeared to be that economic leverage would eventually produce diplomatic flexibility. But infrastructure does not respond to political messaging the same way financial markets do. Because unlike manufactured goods or consumer products, rivers cannot simply be relocated. The Columbia River begins in British Columbia before flowing south into the United States. No executive order changes that geography. No tariff alters the direction of gravity. No political speech changes where the snow falls every winter. That physical reality quietly shaped every negotiation, whether policymakers acknowledged it or not. Canadian officials understood something fundamental. Being upstream creates leverage that cannot easily be replicated. Water storage, seasonal releases, reservoir management, and flood control are not abstract policy discussions. They are operational decisions affecting downstream conditions every day. For decades, those decisions had been coordinated through mutual agreement. Without that cooperation, uncertainty increases not necessarily overnight, but gradually. As infrastructure planning becomes more difficult and long-term investment decisions become less predictable, energy planners dislike uncertainty. Farmers dislike uncertainty. Shipping companies dislike uncertainty. Electric grid operators dislike uncertainty even more. Because electricity generated through hydropower depends on careful coordination months before consumers ever flip a light switch. That is why engineers often describe river management as a continuous balancing act, rather than a series of isolated decisions. Every release of water influences future reservoir levels. Every reservoir affects downstream generation. Every downstream facility affects electricity prices across the region. The system functions because every component expects the others to remain coordinated. Once that expectation weakens, planners begin preparing for contingencies instead of efficiencies. And contingency planning is almost always more expensive. This is where the story becomes much larger than a disagreement between two neighboring governments. Modern infrastructure depends on predictability. Power grids are designed around long-term operating assumptions. Agricultural investment depends on reliable irrigation forecasts. Industrial facilities calculate decades of electricity costs before deciding where to build. Shipping networks schedule cargo months in advance. All of those systems assume stable cooperation across the border. When political uncertainty enters that equation, the effects spread far beyond diplomacy. Investors notice. Utilities notice. Insurance companies notice. Commodity markets notice. Even before any physical disruption occurs, uncertainty itself begins carrying economic costs. That doesn't mean an immediate crisis is inevitable. Far from it. The river continues flowing. The dams continue operating. Electricity continues reaching homes. But strategic analysts often distinguish between operational stability and structural vulnerability. Operationally, everything may continue functioning normally. Structurally, however, the assumptions supporting that stability may already be changing. And history shows that infrastructure systems often appear perfectly stable right up until the moment political relationships surrounding them begin shifting. That is why so many experts argue the real issue is not whether water suddenly stops flowing tomorrow. The real question is whether decades of predictable cooperation can continue if both governments increasingly view critical infrastructure through the lens of geopolitical competition rather than mutual dependence. Because once infrastructure becomes part of strategic bargaining, every future negotiation becomes more complicated than the last. The deeper question, however, isn't whether the river keeps flowing today. It is whether North America can continue relying on a framework built on trust itself is becoming harder to sustain. For decades, the Columbia River represented something unusual in international politics. It proved that geography did not have to become a source of conflict. Instead, both countries accepted a simple reality cooperation produced greater long-term benefits than competition ever could. That philosophy helped create one of the world's most successful examples of shared water management. Today, that assumption is being tested. The debate is no longer limited to engineering or flood prevention. It has become part of a much broader conversation about economic security, supply chains, critical infrastructure, and national leverage. And once infrastructure becomes part of geopolitical competition, every future negotiation carries greater strategic weight. From Washington's perspective, international agreements are increasingly viewed through the lens of national bargaining power. Policymakers have argued that long-standing arrangements should be reassessed if they no longer reflect America's economic interests or negotiating position. Supporters believe tougher bargaining ultimately produces better outcomes. From Ottawa's perspective, however, the issue looks very different. Canadian officials see the river not as a trade concession, but as shared infrastructure built through decades of investment and mutual sacrifice. They argue that predictable cooperation created enormous economic value on both sides of the border, and that turning critical infrastructure into a negotiating tool introduces uncertainty where stability once existed. Neither side views itself as acting irrationally. Each believes it is protecting its own national interests. That is precisely what makes infrastructure disputes so difficult to resolve. Unlike tariffs, they cannot simply be adjusted every few months. Unlike consumer goods, they cannot be redirected through different suppliers. Infrastructure creates dependency over decades. Changing that dependency often requires decades more. Consider what would be required if either country attempted to redesign the entire system. New reservoirs cannot be constructed quickly. Hydroelectric dams require years of environmental review. Engineering, financing, and construction. Transmission networks cannot simply be relocated because political priorities change. Agricultural regions cannot instantly shift to entirely different water sources, even if unlimited funding were available. Physical geography would still impose limits that politics cannot erase. This is why strategic planners often describe water infrastructure as one of the least flexible forms of national power. Military assets can be redeployed. Factories can eventually relocate. Capital can move across borders. Rivers cannot. That reality creates an unusual balance of influence. Canada cannot easily replace the American market. The United States cannot easily replace the Canadian watershed. Each side depends on the other in different ways. For more than half a century, that mutual dependence encouraged cooperation. The question now is whether it continues encouraging cooperation or begins encouraging leverage. Energy analysts are already watching closely. The Pacific Northwest remains one of North America's largest renewable energy regions. with hydroelectric generation providing stability that intermittent energy sources often cannot guarantee on their own. Grid operators value predictable river management because electricity demand changes daily, while water storage must be planned seasonally. If uncertainty grows around future coordination, utilities may eventually begin investing in additional backup generation, expanded transmission capacity, or alternative energy sources. Those investments improve resilience. They also increase costs. Agricultural planners face similar calculations. Farmers make planting decisions months before harvest. Irrigation forecasts influence crop selection, financing, equipment purchases, and insurance coverage. Even small increases in uncertainty can affect investment decisions across an entire growing season. Shipping companies face another challenge. The Columbia River has long served as a major transportation corridor connecting inland producers with Pacific export markets. Maintaining reliable navigation depends on coordinated water management just as much as hydroelectric production does. Every sector sees the same underlying issue. Predictability has economic value. Uncertainty carries a price. That price may not appear immediately, but over time, businesses begin making decisions based not only on today's conditions, but on what they expect conditions to look like years from now. This is why infrastructure policy often matters long before physical infrastructure actually changes. Perception shapes investment. Investment shapes economic growth. And economic growth shapes strategic influence. Perhaps the most important lesson from this entire episode is how easily geography can be underestimated. Political administrations change. Trade policies change. Diplomatic priorities shift. But rivers continue following the same path they have followed for thousands of years. Nature rarely adjusts itself to political calendars. That is something history repeatedly reminds policymakers. Some of the world's most enduring strategic relationships are not built around ideology or military alliances. They are built around shared infrastructure. Shared rivers, shared power grids, shared transportation corridors, shared supply chains. These systems often remain invisible precisely because they work so well. Only when political tension begins affecting them do most people realize how dependent modern economies have become on cooperation that operates quietly in the background every single day. Looking ahead, several paths remain possible. One possibility is renewed negotiations. Both governments could eventually conclude that long-term stability serves their interests better than prolonged uncertainty. Modernization efforts could resume under a different political environment, allowing technical cooperation to move forward regardless of broader trade disagreements. A second possibility is prolonged ambiguity. The existing framework continues functioning, while larger political disputes remain unresolved. Day-to-day operations proceed normally, but major long-term decisions become increasingly difficult as both sides hesitate to make commitments extending decades into the future. A third possibility is gradual strategic decoupling. Neither side seeks confrontation, but both begin investing in reducing future dependence wherever possible. New energy infrastructure, alternative transportation networks, and revised planning assumptions slowly reshape the relationship, not because cooperation collapses overnight, but because both governments prepare for a future in which cooperation can no longer be taken for granted. Each path carries different costs. Each reflects different assumptions about the future of North American relations. What happens next will depend less on the river itself than on the political decisions surrounding it. Because the Columbia River has never really been just about water. It is about energy, food security, transportation, infrastructure, economic resilience, and ultimately, the quiet reality that geography often shapes national strategy far more than political speeches ever can. Perhaps that is the biggest lesson of all. In modern geopolitics, the most valuable strategic asset is not always an aircraft carrier, a missile system, or a trade agreement. Sometimes, it is simply being upstream. And as Washington and Ottawa continue navigating one of the most consequential infrastructure relationships on the continent, one question will continue hanging over every future negotiation. When geography provides one country with permanent leverage, can diplomacy keep that leverage from becoming a source of lasting division? That answer may shape not only the future of the Columbia River, but the future of North American strategic cooperation itself.